Please welcome Dr. Pippa Notten.
So I've been invited to speak to you to share some of my knowledge and experience with life cycle assessment, and especially how that's touched on plastic over the years. And I'm a director at a consultancy called The Greenhouse. There we go. We've also got more recently an NPC called TGH ThinkSpace, and we share our work between that depending on our client, I guess. So we do quite a lot of work with WWF and more recently with United Nations Environment Programme, so that we channel through the not-for-profit. But my primary vehicle is The Greenhouse. We've been going for about 13 years, coming up for 13 years this year. And I do life cycle assessment, although our consultancy is broader. We do broad sustainability and especially a lot of climate work. But today I'm really focusing on our life cycle assessment work and how that, so I'm going to start, I think in Harrow's talk you already heard the term life cycle assessment quite a bit, but I'm not taking for granted the background of everybody on life cycle assessment. So first we'll just take a step back and actually define and what are we talking about when we talk about LCAs. And then just to give some insights into the work I've done. So this is a picture, if you've done any looking up of LCA, you've probably seen something similar. It's in the name, really, life cycle. So it's this idea of taking a product or service, a product system or service that the product offers, to be more correct there, and it follows it throughout its life cycle or its value chain, using those two terms somewhat interchangeably. So it's taking it from all the way from extracting raw materials, then through manufacturing, distribution, retail. The use is often the most important stage for many products. So even if you're the manufacturer, often what you need, your impacts may be happening here, your any disposal, recycling, and then the end of life. So it is a model. It's done in a software. You collect data on each of these stages, and they all get summed up into this big life cycle model. And it's a model of the consequences of products or services on our health, on the health of ecosystems, and the availability of resources over their entire value chain. So even, and I'm guilty of this myself in the results I'm going to show, we often talk LCA and we end up actually showing results for carbon footprint, which is similar to what we've just seen in the previous talk, and I'm falling into that trap again. But if you look into a full LCA report, the idea is actually that along with this core concept of taking the whole life cycle or value chain into account, the other important aspect is taking all relevant environmental impacts into account. And then the third core concept there is just to provide you with this framework, a sort of a set of guidelines. There is actually an international standard, an ISO standard, which gets republished as a SANS standard on life cycle assessment, so it is a procedure and a framework to follow, which helps with making these studies sort of representative and hopefully somewhat reproducible. So why do we need life cycle assessment? It sounds like a complicated undertaking, and it certainly is a data-intensive undertaking to go and collect data on each one of those life cycle stages. It's really because if we want to assess our product systems, or if we want to improve them, we really need to be able to measure them. So we talk about sustainability, and interestingly, sustainability often means different things to different people, what they value, be it the economic sustainability, or is it perhaps the social sustainability, or the environmental sustainability. It means different things to different people. But how do we actually measure it? What do we mean when we say sustainability? So life cycle assessment is really around this idea of trying to put metrics behind sustainability, actually measuring it. So just to give an example here, if we were an eco-conscious consumer and you really want to go out there and make the right decision, would you buy a cotton t-shirt or should we buy a polyester t-shirt? Is one more inherently sustainable than another? Often the green feel is for, if it's renewable, then it's more green, then it's more sustainable. But what if it's a recycled, what if the polyester is from recycled PET bottles? Then that's also got green credentials. So now which one is actually the sort of the greener, the choice, the more sustainable choice? So to put that in numbers, again, as I said, I apologize, just for ease of presentation, I then also tend to end up showing carbon footprint most of the time. But there are metrics that cover the wider range, and I'll go into that a little bit further in the talk. But this is the carbon footprint, which I think is a relatively familiar concept to most people. It's an easy metric that's gained quite a lot of traction. Everyone knows what we're talking about. It's the greenhouse gases, and it leads to climate change. And there I've got LCA. People love bar graphs, so I'm afraid you'll see a lot of bar graphs in this talk coming up. But what it really is showing is we're building up the life cycle, with each of these blocks being one of those stages in that circular life cycle diagram. So the bottom being fiber production, then making the yarn, then knitting the t-shirt fabric, and then the last one being the actual making the apparel, sort of making the t-shirt itself. And we build up the carbon footprint over those life cycle stages. So here you can see the polyester t-shirt. I mean, there's loads of, so many background here. So this is really mainly for illustrative purposes. I can go to depth if you want afterwards. But polyester comes up slightly higher than the cotton t-shirt, about 10% higher carbon footprint. But if we look at other metrics, so here deviating from this idea of just looking at carbon footprint, we can see that the cotton t-shirt, on this graph is now actually showing an indicator of ecosystem impact. So it's called species affected per year, but basically it's a broad impact on ecosystems. And you can see the cotton now has an impact almost double that of the polyester t-shirt. And that's really because of the cotton farming, which takes a lot of land. There's inputs of pesticides, fertilizers, and all of that adds up to quite a big ecosystem impact relative to the polyester t-shirt. Not shown here, but the water, if we show a water footprint, the disparity is even greater. The cotton t-shirt has about 10 times the water consumption of the polyester t-shirt. So just to show, we surely, the reason for life cycle assessment saying that we really must try and balance our decisions across all relevant impacts, because if we made our decision on carbon footprint, we would make a different one, or perhaps we'd make a different one. It really would come down to how we value carbon footprint versus water footprint versus ecosystem impact as to which one should we actually go for. That actually was just the t-shirt itself. What I've shown here is just this next aspect of LCA, is the importance of taking the whole value chain or life cycle into account. Previously, I was stopping at the apparel, so I've grouped up those life cycle stages a bit. So now it's just manufacturing is all the fiber and the knitting and the textile production, and then the retail and distribution. Again, the polyester coming out slightly higher when you're just looking at the t-shirt basis itself. But if we extend this to the actual wear of the t-shirt, and assuming here this is a perfect world and consumers actually read their care labels, the cotton t-shirt has a care label that says wash warm, and it's ironed, and it's okay to tumble dry it, whereas the polyester t-shirt said wash cold, do not iron, hang up to dry. So if you did those things, the use actually adds considerably to the carbon footprint, and that's specifically the heating of the water to wash. So in many, many products, we see the use phase, if not more important, or adding considerably into the life cycle. So here again, if we look at the per wear of t-shirt rather than just per t-shirt, we get a completely different carbon footprint result. So that's the reason for wanting to do a life cycle rather than just product basis analysis. So this idea of taking all relevant impacts into account, I certainly don't want to make this a terribly technical talk and try and keep it relatively high level, but this is a rather complicated slide, so I apologize. But when I talk impact assessment, and I say, we take all relevant impacts into account, ideally we're taking all relevant sustainability impacts into account, but you'll probably have noticed already I've only been talking environmental impacts. So traditional LCA is very much dealing with environmental impacts. And although, as I said in my first slide, we want to look at the consequences on human health and on ecosystem health and on our resource base, that's here at the end, so that's what we're wanting to look at. What we end up measuring are actually what in the middle here, and they may be familiar to some of you. Certainly climate change is there, so carbon footprint. Some of them like ozone depletion, smog formation, human tox. Those are the actual effects that are measurable. And there's a large number of them, and this is just one set, fairly well recognized set, well-accepted set, but there are those that are others. And just to point out, these are really research areas. A lot of good international research groups work on impact assessment, and as they gain traction and consensus, then they get put into the softwares, and us as practitioners use them. What has been a big issue lately is marine plastic pollution, and everyone pointing out that LCAs are really poor at taking in or any indicators of plastic pollution, in that it assesses quite well plastic that's properly managed within the economy. So we look at the manufacturing impacts, we look at the disposal impacts, if it's landfilled or if it's incinerated, those are included. But what happens, of course, is that there's a fair, the empirical evidence is there's a clear amount of plastic that isn't going into that formal system that's being modeled. And that's really a lack of data on both the amounts of plastic that leak out into the environment, because you need that data if you're going to be able to model it, and on the impacts of plastic in marine systems. So at the moment, there is just not that science, but it's a very big research area, and there's a big international LCA project called LCA that is looking at incorporating those sort of indicators into LCA. And then, so I've been talking sustainability, and I always say that LCA gives us sustainability metrics, but in reality, we very much still focused on the environmental aspect of sustainability, largely because that's where the science has been and the indicators are. So it's relatively doable. But you may well have heard of LCSA. Certainly if anyone's picked up the CSIR LCA bag study, they called it an LCSA, with the idea of making sure that we don't just look at environmental sustainability, but we remember these three pillars or legs, as I've got them there, of sustainability that must all be balanced if we want to have sustainable development. The idea of and I think Hara already went into this somewhat, but the idea of people, planet, and profits. So there's two ways, and again, this is really an emerging field still. So LCA itself, as I said, it has an ISO standard. It's relatively well established. It's been done well more than 20 years now, closer to 30 actually, I guess. Mid-90s was the first sort of guideline that came out. There are two ways of broadening this, the environmental LCA, and that's to do complementary assessments. So there is other assessments. One's called life cycle costing that looks at economic costs across the value chain. And there's also a tool called social LCA, and that's, I think, is currently an international standards under development, but it isn't quite there yet, and that's called social LCA. I apologize, there's actually an error in my slide here. So when I say LCSA, it should be LCA plus LCC plus SLCA, so that we want the three dimensions of sustainability. So I've actually left off the environmental one there, but the idea of we broadening to include the economic and the social. The problem being that social LCA is very difficult to put on the same basis because it's often not not as quantitative. So environmental things, so greenhouse gases, we can measure them, we can add them up, we can make an indicator, as Hara has well demonstrated in his previous talk. One we can do is jobs, so that's a nice quantitative social metric that we can actually also add up over the value chain and put together. But when it comes to things like working conditions, governance, social justice, ability to unionize, which are the kind of indicators you see at social LCA, those are qualitative things, and it's very difficult to then build a framework where you have qualitative impacts and quantitative impacts. So that's why it's sort of been a slow. There are people that do it, and there are various ways using, but it is quite challenging. So another way of doing social LCA is to say, well, rather than try and add three somewhat disparate things, is what we really need is a really great transdisciplinary framework where we integrate models. Where I had that long list of indicators, we'll just have social indicators there already put together, and that is another big research field that's going, and I think would make the whole LCSA more workable, but it is a work in progress. And ultimately, actually, there's also an interesting research project that's really looking at linking LCSA to the SDGs. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals was sort of a first good attempt at really quantifying what do we mean by sustainability, what are all these aspects. It actually goes beyond just those three pillars. And critically for this, they even put in there's it is an attempt towards measuring sustainable development. And the ideas, well then ultimately what our indicator said should be, it should actually go map onto these SDGs. So, but that's to come. Unfortunately for now, we're stuck with our environmental framework, so certainly in the work that I'm showing has been the more traditional LCAs. So just to wrap up this introductory part, why do LCAs? I think there's three sort of clear ways there. I think often we sit in the middle, which is the strategic and marketing. People like to come and ask us to do an LCA when they see that their product is possibly better or more sustainable than their competitors, and they'd like to be able to put that in their marketing material. Always a little bit of a nerve-wracking thing to do because there's lots of assumptions that can go into LCAs. But that's certainly one thing. The other, probably what I'd say is a better use is this idea of using it to improve your product systems, exploring your impacts, and really doing an LCA really makes you engage with your whole supply chain, your stakeholders, your users, and critically you find out where are your hotspots, where should you be focusing your efforts. It actually could be a raw material supplier that you just need to change. It's often not your actual production. So where do you focus your efforts to overall improve the sustainability of your products? And increasingly, we're seeing it in policy, certainly in the European Union. There's the product environmental footprint, PEF, which are basically just LCAs with stricter product category rules. So more and more we are seeing it coming into policy. Okay, so moving on. Hopefully that gave you more of a background of what I'm talking about now for the rest, which is sort of LCAs that we've done. And I'm focusing a lot on food value chains because that's work that we've done with WWF South Africa, and they are always more open in getting the research that we've done out there rather than, I guess, company LCAs, which obviously are confidential because it's, you're not always wanting to put out what you found. And then the second bit of work I wanted to talk about was work we've been doing with UNEP on looking at recommendations from LCAs on single-use plastic products. So this was our meta-study. So rather than us doing LCAs, it's big literature reviews looking at all the LCAs that have been done in the past decade or so on single-use plastic products and their alternatives. And this is a good example of policy being used in LCA because this work actually came from the United Nations Environment Assembly, who said to tasked UNEP with this project of saying what recommendations can LCA provide on single-use plastic products and their alternatives. So starting with a LCA we did on steak, retailed in South Africa. So going up, this is also serves as, I guess, an example of what first step of when you come to do an LCA, you draw up your product value chain, all your blocks, all your value chain stages. So when we're talking about steak, we start with the farm. Most of the meat in South Africa, about 96%, I think, when we did this project a couple of years ago now, was feedlot. And critically then, of course, is to include the growing of the maize and all the other feeds that go into the feedlot. Then the rest of the value chain is the abattoir, the processing, the packaging that you've seen in this picture, the manufacture of that, and then the distribution and the retail. So we didn't include the consumer here, we stopped at the retail, but the disposal of packaging is included. So jumping straight to the bar graph, and once again, I apologize, it's the carbon footprint. But really just what jumps out, I think, on this is that all of the carbon footprint, 90% of it, just over 90%, really lies with the cattle on the farm. All of these other bars, which is from the abattoir up, are really, really small. And this arrow is pointing at the packaging. In there, we've actually grouped the manufacturing of the packaging and the disposal of the packaging. So as the consumer, we may get irritated with all these overly packaged foods, but it's quite nice to see a picture like that. So certainly for certain products, that packaging really isn't playing a huge role, at least in the carbon footprint. But you actually get quite a similar picture, or even more stark picture for other impacts. So it's not just for carbon footprint. When we looked at land footprint, the packaging has an even smaller impact, and water as well. So certainly in a meat, and this is actually true. So now this is a study on milk. So for these animal kind of food products, you get very similar picture, not quite as dramatic, about 60% in this one in milk impacts occur on the farm, but still it's very dramatic. Some that lower, that 60%, is actually partly because in this one we actually included the consumer as well, so that dilutes that down a bit. But again, packaging, only about 5% of the impacts of the milk that you drink is actually the HDPE plastic bottle. And again, for water, that's even more stark. It really is, really all about what goes on the farm when it comes to water impact. But just in case you're getting comfortable, don't think, of course, that's true for every product. So we can say, well, fabulous packaging, it doesn't matter, we don't have to focus on it at all. That's not true for all product systems, so there was a bit of a bias to show because it was animal products, in which case you do get that effect quite strongly. But when you're looking at other products, so certainly if you got to a tomato sauce, which is in a heavier packaging, a glass bottle, and a less impact-intensive product, tomatoes sort of versus meat, then you don't, then you can start getting the packaging actually playing quite an important role in the life cycle of the product system. But even in these ones where I have the very low, where packaging seems to show so little impact, we could say, like, oh, well, then the packaging doesn't matter. But actually, it's the opposite conclusion is actually really true, because packaging plays a really important role in those food value chains, which I've tried to show with this slide. So this is actually a comparison of fresh milk and long life milk. So the fresh milk being in the HDPE bottle and the long life milk being in a carton. Again, the blocks build up the life cycle. So the green is the raw milk, the farm stage, and then we've got processing and packaging, and then distribution, retail, consumer, and then the primary packaging at the top. So if you actually just looked at the top two bars, the primary packaging, you see that the carton actually has a higher packaging footprint, especially if you take the secondary packaging into account. So if you're just looking at those two bars, then the two top packaging and primary and secondary packaging, the carton has a slightly higher carbon footprint. But when you include the whole life cycle, the fact that the fresh milk has higher losses at retail, or higher returns, let's say, and especially high impacts in retail because of the cold chain. So distribution and retail, you're requiring that cold chain. And then interestingly, also quite significantly higher impacts from the consumer, because consumers tend to buy long life milk in bulk, whereas fresh milk are, every couple of days goes off to the shop. And I guess this, for the particular retailer that this was done, it was very much the consumer that gets in their car and drives to the shops to buy their milk. And you actually see that coming out quite strongly when you're going for milk-motivated purchases, let's say. So all of those aspects actually more than compensate for the fact that the long life milk has higher processing, sort of higher when the UHT processing here is indeed higher, but all of this adds up to the fresh milk actually having the longer. So it's not only the packaging, but certainly the packaging impact, your choice of packaging then actually affects your whole value chain, really. And critically, the packaging choice affects the losses. And when we think of those previous graphs I've shown, what you're really, really needing to do is when your impacts are all with your product, what you're really needing to do and choose your packaging carefully for is reducing and keeping those losses as low as possible. So moving on to a slightly different kind of more recent work we did. So with all this focus on plastic, we did another recent project looking at fresh produce value chains. Actually, cucumbers and raspberries were the products we actually chose at the end, largely because they had a lot of use of plastic throughout their value chain. So we were looking for products that not only are packaging, so the consumers get irritated with the wrapping on the cucumber, and they get irritated with the PET thermoforms, blocking, kind of adding to their recycling and their refuse load. But actually, we wanted to look at products that had all throughout their value chain. So this is a raspberry growing system in tunnels, and this is actually a cucumbers in a multi-span greenhouse, and you'll see they're in plastic pots. There's plastic lining, the walls are plastic, there's twine. I think the raspberry farm used when they sent us how much plastic twine they used, and we said, really, is this correct? And they joked that the farm manager always say they use twine to the moon and back, and it's about right. So there's a really interesting large amount of plastic that goes into these more modern growing systems. But the reason is because they really add tangible benefits into the growing systems. In the Western Cape, if you've traveled around, you'll see more and more, of those multi-spans, because they really, really help with keeping water down. So during the water crisis, they really improved. And then also less pesticides are needed in those enclosed greenhouses. So they have higher benefits. So just sort of this graph is a plastic footprint now, which we developed for this project. Again, these are the life cycle stages of the cucumber farming, trying to match the colors here. So this is actually the farm. So plastic use on the farm, interestingly, way outweighs the actual plastic use further up the value chain. It's a bit confusing here, but actually the plastic wrap manifests in the consumer stage here, because that's where it gets disposed. Just to show another slide, this is the one on raspberries. It also had that the use is not quite as dramatic, because the wrap in the cucumber is extremely lightweight. So they're slightly less dramatic as the previous graph in terms of the spread of plastic across the value chain. But certainly in raspberries, we had the luxury of a farm which had a lot of data, and they had 2 growing systems on their farm. The tunnel grown, which was the picture I had earlier, that uses some 22 times more plastic per hectare than the shade grown, which is a simpler structure. It was just a shade net over the raspberry plants. So even though that the tunnel grown uses 22 times more plastic, when we compare across all these indicators, so this is a better example of different life cycle indicators, climate change and water footprint and human health and ecosystems and non-renewable resources, and then also that plastic index we developed. It's really interesting that even though the tunnel grown, you can really see here the benefit that plastic is bringing into this value chain, halving climate change, more than halving water impact. And that's really just because of this very higher yield that you get when growing under tunnels rather than in the open. So it was, I thought, even really interesting. We thought that we could actually sort of quantify that benefit versus the impact that the plastic has in value chains, food value chains. Okay, and on to the final studies that I was just really quickly going to profile today. And this is that UNEP project that I mentioned earlier. So the project is called Addressing Single-Use Plastics Products Pollution Using a Life Cycle Approach. And you could go and see all these reports on this website here of the Life Cycle Initiative. They're a group that sits in UNEP, focusing particularly on life cycle work. They chose a suite of sort of common products. We've been just doing these last ones, so beverage cups, tableware, nappies, menstrual products, and face masks. Still busy with the last ones, but the top 3 of the reports are out. Quite a busy graph. Graphic, really. But I brought it up mainly just to show that when you do reviews of LCAs like this, and if you read those reports, it's quite frustrating, because really the result ends up, well, it depends. And I think LCA gets a lot of criticism for that reason, going so far as saying it's which consultant you hire as which result you can get, which I don't really agree with that, not if it's a peer-reviewed study. But there are a lot of context-dependent aspects in a study that can push it either way. So what we've tried to do in our studies was, instead of just saying, well, it depends, which one is preferred, we wanted to say it depends within certain context, one or the other comes out as preferred. So here, not going into the detail of actually different materials so much, but just what does start to emerge from these, if you look at multiple studies done over the years, is that reusables tend to start come out, and that certainly supports the movement towards a circular economy. So the blue box here, this is actually, so to back up a bit, this is for looking at LCAs on beverage cups, hot and cold. The blue blocks are where reusables were preferred. The orangey ones are where single use was preferred. And then the sort of split one is when there was no clear preference. Basically, there's studies that say one, and there's studies that say the other. And you can't really draw any firm conclusions. But as I said, instead of this, it depends, we really wanted to show that it depends on the context. And really important is this use phase. So where, regardless of the material of the reusable cup, so whether if it's a plastic reusable cup or a ceramic mug or stainless steel for a cold beverage, what really matters is how that cup is washed in its use phase. So if it's washed efficiently in a modern dishwasher, then the reusable is preferred. But if it's inefficiently washed by hand in hot water, then the single-use option is preferred. So before we even get to different materials, what we could start seeing emerging was at least the split sort of between reusable and single-use. So these are some of our main contexts that we picked out, but washing is one of them. And reuse, sorry, that's the other really important one. So if you have a reusable, and this is true, and certainly of all those products, so bags has emerged. So the plastic bag often does come out, the thicker plastic bag comes out as the best single-use option. But the critical parameter then is how often it's reused. So if you're going to make a thicker bag and you only use it once, of course it's a whole lot worse than the thin plastic bag only used once. But if you use it for its design life of 20 times or something, then the reusable would be preferred. So it really comes down to, if we want to push for the circular economy and reusable options, we really need consumers to play along, reuse the reusable options, wash them efficiently, and don't litter them. So here we have our say, less eco-conscious, or we call them indifferent consumers to be, and they, that's where a single-use option, if you're going to treat a reusable option badly, you may as well have used a single-use option, especially if you're in a context where it is likely to be recycled or incinerated, so that this is global. So certainly in Europe, if you're incinerating your single-use option and you're getting energy back from that incineration, and you're having consumers that aren't actually doing the right thing, then actually you are better off still sitting in the realm of single-use. This is the tableware results, similar, a little bit less complicated, but shows much the same thing, that the context is really important. Here with tableware, so when I talk tableware, it was looking at knives and forks and picnic-style bowls and plates. And you see here the problem often is that it's difficult to recycle because of the contamination with the food waste. So where possible, wherever practical, the reusables did come out best. So in food context, so in contexts like hospitals and canteens and that, where you couldn't separate the food waste from the tableware and wash it and reuse it. If it's practical, then reusable comes out best. But where we're sitting where it's not practical, say festivals or those sort of things, it was interesting to hear to talk a little bit about materials, I guess. There's maybe a push to think that a bamboo fork or a bioplastic fork is better than a fossil plastic fork. But if that bamboo fork is just going to be thrown into the waste, the municipal waste stream and landfilled, and it actually has higher impacts in its manufacture, it's no better. It's actually, the fossil-based plastic still actually comes out as the best option. So in here, it really depends a lot on the waste management context. So along with the consumer aspects, the other really important one is the waste management infrastructure and context within the country. So before, the fiber boards and the bioplastics are great, and they work really well because they can be disposed of with the food waste, so the contamination. But if you don't have the infrastructure for industrial composting or anaerobic digestion, and that's not happening, then they are a higher impact than traditional sort of single-use plastic tableware. So very much the context. I think this pretty much summarizes what I've tried to show with those graphics before. But reusable, so certainly we see support for the circular economy. So LCA is not synonymous with the circular economy, and certainly I think it supports the circular economy, but importantly it isn't always, because we throw up unpopular results sometimes, like those that I've just showed in the previous, where single-use alternatives may actually still be better. Or when you say better, perhaps what we should be saying is we can point out why single use is still better and where you must be fixing the context. You must be improving your, educating your consumers to wash better. You must be improving your waste management systems so that you can move towards the circular economy or the reusable option. So yeah, how consumer behavior is really important. Where there were options, where looking at the single-use options, lightweight, the other big overarching finding is lightweight is always better. And I guess it's somewhat obvious, but in just about all these product systems that were looked at with these meta-studies, the impact lies in the raw materials and in the production. So where you can use lightweight materials, where you can use lightweight products, where you can use less material, is always better. And that's a much stronger finding than the different materials. So often in LCAs of packaging, we get really caught up in this, the paper and the plastic, the bioplastic now, the different materials. And this is where LCA studies really don't yet, you can find studies that show one or the other, and it really does depend, often on the waste management infrastructure. So within these meta-studies, we really can't come out with strong recommendations for which material is better, because it really depends on what the context, and also not only just on the end of life of those, so certain materials have better end of life or better suited to certain infrastructure, waste infrastructure. So certainly like a plastic, if it's being recycled or even if it's being incinerated with energy recovery, it is relatively low impact end of life. Even a landfill actually is a low impact end of life, relatively low impact end of life for plastic, because it essentially locks up that carbon in a sink. But also important is the manufacturing. So not only is it just the end of life, and what it often is the carbon intensity of electricity. And I guess not only of electricity, but of the resource. So as Hara showed, I guess with the Sasol being really carbon intensive for us, that becomes an issue. So not just electricity, but of your resource, where you're getting your resources from, it makes a big difference. And yeah, so just to wrap up, I hope I did give some background and clarity on what LCA is, as we bandy it about more and more nowadays as a term. I think, I often hope I don't want to focus too much on the negative. It is data intensive, it is time consuming, and it can give you weirdly conflicting results. So I really like to stress that it's really more about the learning than on the result, for me, certainly. And when we work with people doing LCAs, I think it's about understanding those trade-offs, it's about understanding your hotspots, and it's understanding about how you can improve your product system or your sector. I mean, a lot of LCAs are done by industry sector bodies, and that's especially in Europe. So I always find this quote really wraps it up nicely. So when that all models are wrong, but some are useful. You may have heard that before. And it is actually, it's not written for LCA, thankfully. It really means any model is a simplification of reality. That's what a model is. We are trying our best to represent reality, but you can never be 100% correct. But they are useful because you can do all sorts of scenario, you can do a whole lot of learning. So try not to get too caught up in that final number. So thank you.